In the early 1990s on Long Island, New York, two women were found murdered in wooded areas, a few months and a few miles apart. The first was named Rita Tangredi. She was 31 years old. The second was named Colleen McNamee. She was 20. Both women had been beaten, and both had been strangled. And both of them, in life, had lived on the hard margins of society. Women who struggled, who were vulnerable, who were, in the eyes of a world that is quick to look away from certain kinds of victims, easy to overlook. Their cases went cold. For 20 years, no one was held to account for what was done to them. The killer had made what should have been a fatal mistake. He had left his own DNA on both of his victims. That genetic evidence was collected, and it was preserved. But when investigators ran it through the criminal DNA database, it came back to no one. The man who murdered Rita and Colleen simply wasn't in the system. He had never been convicted of a crime that would have collected his DNA, and so his genetic signature sat there, a perfect portrait of a killer with no name, for 2 long decades. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones where justice arrives through the strangest, most unexpected door, subscribe to Decades Cold, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. And the door it came through here is one of the most remarkable in the history of forensic science. Because in 2013, a man named Timothy Bittrolff was convicted of a minor crime, a small, unrelated offense. And under a bold and controversial New York law, one that required a DNA sample from every single person convicted of any crime at all, no matter how trivial, Timothy Bittrolff had to give his DNA. When they entered it into the database, it did not match any crime, but it came back as something else, a partial match. The DNA on the bodies of Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee belonged to someone closely related to Timothy. It belonged to his brother. A DNA test that the killer himself had never taken, given instead by his own brother for a completely unrelated crime, reached across 20 years and pointed straight at him. This is the story of Rita and Colleen, two women the world was too quick to forget, and the landmark case that proved a killer could be caught not by his own DNA, but by the blood running in his family. Before I tell you anything else, I want to talk about who Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee were, and I want to do it carefully and deliberately, because this is a case where the victims were, from the very beginning, at risk of being reduced to a category instead of remembered as people. You will see them described, in the reporting, as prostitutes. And I want to set that word down gently and look past it, because it is the least important thing about either of them, and because the tendency to let a word like that stand in for a whole human being is exactly the tendency that let their killer operate and let their cases go cold. Rita Tangredi was 31 years old, and the detail I want you to hold on to about Rita is this. She was a mother. She had a son named Anthony, and Anthony was 11 years old when his mother was murdered. 11 years old when the person who loved him and raised him was taken from him and left in the woods. Whatever struggles Rita had in her life, whatever hard circumstances had pushed her to the margins, she was, to a little boy, simply his mom. And he lost her, and then he grew up, waiting, for 20 years, to find out who had done it. Colleen McNamee was even younger. She was just 20 years old, 20, a young woman barely out of her teens, with, in a fairer world, an entire life still in front of her. These were not disposable people. There is no such thing as a disposable person. But our society, and sometimes our justice system, treats certain victims as though there were. Women who are poor, women who struggle with addiction, women who trade sex to survive, women who don't fit the profile of the victim, whose murder makes the front page and mobilizes a task force. When those women are killed, the machinery of outrage and urgency too often just doesn't engage the way it should. And killers know this. Predators specifically target the vulnerable and the overlooked, precisely because they calculate, often correctly, that these deaths will be investigated less intensely and mourned less publicly. So I want to be clear about the stance of this channel. Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee mattered. Their lives mattered, and their deaths mattered. And the fact that it took 20 years to answer for them is not a reflection of their worth. It is a reflection of ours. The first discovery came on November 2, 1993. Rita Tangredi's body was found in a wooded area in East Patchogue in Suffolk County on Long Island. She had been beaten and she had been strangled. I'm going to state that once and leave the rest of the details where they belong, unspoken, because they are brutal and degrading and they do nothing to honor her. What matters is that Rita was the victim of a savage, close, personal act of violence, and that her body was left in the woods, discarded, by someone who clearly believed she would never be avenged. Then, less than 3 months later, on January 30th, 1994, it happened again. The body of Colleen McNamee was found in a wooded area in Shirley, New York, a different spot, several miles away from where Rita had been left, and the similarities were immediate and chilling. Colleen, too, had been strangled. Colleen, too, had been left in a remote, wooded place. The manner of the two killings, the type of victim, the disposal of the bodies in secluded woods, it all pointed to a single, terrible conclusion. The same man had done both. Long Island had a predator, hunting vulnerable women, and he had killed at least twice in the space of a single winter. Investigators worked the cases, and crucially, this is the thing that would matter 20 years later. They recovered and preserved biological evidence from both victims. The killer, in the course of these attacks, had left his DNA behind, on both Rita and on Colleen. In the early 1990s, DNA science was still young, but it was advanced enough to develop a profile, and forward-thinking enough that Suffolk County authorities carefully preserved that evidence, holding on to it even as the cases went cold. That decision, to save the evidence, to hold the killer's genetic signature in storage against some future that could use it, is the quiet hero of this entire story. Because for 20 years, that preserved DNA was the only thing standing between this killer and a clean escape. Both cases went cold, and they stayed cold, for the same reason so many of the cases we cover on this channel do. Investigators had the killer's DNA, a full profile, developed from the evidence on both victims, and they had nowhere to look it up. They entered it into CODIS, the National Criminal Database, and searched for a match. And there was none. The man who murdered Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee had never had his DNA collected. As far as the database was concerned, he did not exist. Now, we've talked about this wall many times on this channel, but I want to dwell on the specific version of it here, because it's key to understanding why this case became a landmark. A CODIS search finds you exact matches. It compares your crime scene profile against the profiles on file and looks for the same person. For that to work, your killer has to already be in the database, which generally means he's been convicted of, or arrested for, a qualifying crime. Rita and Colleen's killer had managed to avoid that. Whatever he was not, on paper, a criminal. He had no qualifying conviction. His DNA had never been swabbed, and so the most powerful evidence in the case, his actual genetic identity, sitting right there in an evidence freezer, was useless for finding him, because there was nothing to match it against. For 20 years, that was the end of the road. The killer went on with his life. Rita's son Anthony grew up without his mother and without an answer. Colleen's family grieved a 20-year-old with no explanation. And the two cases became what cold cases become. Files in a drawer, a pair of murdered women slowly slipping out of public memory, exactly as their killer had gambled they would. What none of them could have known was that the key to the whole thing was not going to come from the killer at all. It was going to come from a law and from a brother. To understand how this case broke, you have to understand a piece of policy, and I promise it's more dramatic than it sounds, because this law is the entire reason Rita and Colleen got justice. It's about who, exactly, the government collects DNA from. When DNA databases first began, states collected genetic samples from a narrow group of people, those convicted of the most serious crimes, like murder and sexual offenses. New York started collecting DNA that way in 1996. The logic was intuitive. Take DNA from the worst offenders, because they're the ones most likely to offend again. But over time, a bolder and far more controversial idea took hold. What if you collected DNA from everyone convicted of any crime at all? Not just murderers and rapists, but people convicted of minor offenses, petty crimes, low-level misdemeanors. In 2012, New York did exactly that. It became the first state in the nation to require a DNA sample from every single person convicted of any crime, no matter how minor. This was, and remains, genuinely contested territory, and I want to be fair to both sides of it, because it sits at the heart of this episode. Supporters argued it was a powerful public safety tool. You never know when a person picked up for a small offense is also responsible for something far worse, and casting a wide net catches predators who've otherwise flown under the radar. Critics argued it was a massive expansion of government genetic surveillance, that taking DNA from someone convicted of a trivial offense and holding it forever treats minor offenders like presumptive violent criminals, and, as we're about to see, effectively pulls their innocent relatives into the database too. Both of those arguments are serious, and both are true at once. And the case of Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee is the single clearest illustration you will ever find of exactly what that law can do, for better, and, depending on your view, for more complicated. In December of 2013, a man named Timothy Bittrolff was convicted of a minor offense, the kind of low-level matter that, before 2012, would never have resulted in a DNA sample being taken. But under New York's new all-crimes law, it did. Timothy Bittrolff gave a DNA sample, and it was entered into the state database, as the law now required. And here is where the machinery did something almost no one, outside of a few forensic specialists, fully appreciated it could do. Timothy's DNA was run against the crime scene profiles in the system, and it did not match any of them. Timothy Bittrolff was not the killer of Rita Tangredi or Colleen McNamee, and the database correctly said so. No exact match. But the analysts noticed something else. Timothy's profile was a partial match to the killer's DNA from both murders. Not identical, partial. And a partial match of that specific kind means something very precise in forensic science. It means the actual source of the crime scene DNA is a close biological relative of the person in the database. A parent, a child, or a sibling. This is the technique called familial DNA searching, and it is distinct from the genealogy we so often cover. Genealogy reaches out to distant cousins in public ancestry sites. Familial DNA searching stays inside the government's own criminal database and looks for close relatives, first-degree relatives, of people already in the system. And in December 2013, the government's database, thanks to Timothy Bittrolff's minor conviction, was quietly holding a genetic flare pointing directly at his own family. The lead prosecutor later described the almost accidental nature of it with a line I've never forgotten. The partial match, he said, was inadvertent. The fish, he said, just happened to jump in the boat. Timothy Bittrolff had a brother. His name was John. Once the partial match told investigators that the killer was a close male relative of Timothy Bittrolff, the investigation narrowed with sudden, dramatic speed. They looked at Timothy's family, specifically at the men in it who could be the source of that DNA, and attention settled on Timothy's brother, John Bittrolff. Now, a familial DNA hit is a lead, not proof. It told investigators where to look. It did not by itself prove that John Bittrolff was the killer. For that, they needed John's actual DNA to compare directly against the evidence from Rita's and Colleen's bodies. And they weren't about to ask him for it and tip him off. So they did what investigators do in these situations, the same move we've seen in case after case on this channel. They surveilled John Bittrolff, and they waited for him to discard something with his DNA on it. They followed the trail of ordinary genetic litter that every person leaves behind them in the world, and ultimately, they recovered a discarded plastic cup that John had used and thrown away. They took that cup to the lab, developed his DNA profile from it, and compared it to the genetic evidence preserved from both murder scenes. It was an exact match. The DNA on the cup that John Bittrolff had drunk from and thrown in the trash matched the DNA recovered from the bodies of both Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee. The partial match from his brother had pointed the way. John's own discarded DNA sealed it. On July 21, 2014, More than 20 years after Rita was found in those woods, John Bittrolff was arrested and charged with both murders. The killer, who had never been in the system, who had counted on the anonymity of his overlooked victims and his own clean record, had been caught by the one thing he could not control: the DNA he shared with his brother. So who was John Bittrolff? And the answer, as it so often is on this channel, is unsettling precisely because it is so ordinary. John Bittrolff was a carpenter. He lived in Manorville, a quiet suburban community in Suffolk County. He was, by trade, a skilled craftsman, known for his work, and at the time of his arrest, he was a married man and a father of 2 children. From the outside, he was an utterly unremarkable Long Island family man, a guy with a job, a wife, kids, a house. The kind of man you would never look at twice. And that is the whole chilling point. For 20 years, John Bittrolff lived that ordinary life, in that ordinary community, going home to his own wife and his own children, while the DNA of 2 women he had murdered sat preserved in an evidence freezer, waiting. He had killed Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee, discarded them in the woods, and then simply walked back into his life and stayed there, hidden not behind a disguise or a false name, but behind the sheer unremarkableness of an ordinary man's existence. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He raised a family a few miles from where he'd left his victims. The banality of it is the horror of it. The predator was not a shadowy stranger lurking at the edge of town. He was the neighbor, the carpenter, the dad. He was, in every visible respect, one of the ordinary men, and that camouflage protected him for 2 decades. John Bittrolff went to trial in 2017 in Suffolk County, and it was a substantial proceeding, a 6-week trial, a serious and thorough airing of the evidence, and the keystone of the prosecution's case, the thing everything rested on, was the DNA. Not the familial lead that had found him, that was just the pointer, but the direct, damning fact underneath it. John Bittrolff's own DNA had been recovered from the bodies of both Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee. His genetic material on both victims, in a manner consistent with the killings. That is powerful, direct physical evidence, and it connected him, individually, to each of the 2 women he was accused of murdering. The jury deliberated, and they convicted John Bittrolff on 2 counts of second-degree murder, 1 for Rita, 1 for Colleen. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 25 years to life in prison, which adds up to 50 years to life. And I want to state plainly what that means, because it's the outcome this channel exists to document. John Bittrolff is alive, and he is incarcerated, and he will, in all likelihood, spend the rest of his life behind bars for what he did. He was not identified too late. He did not die before justice could reach him. He was caught, tried, convicted, and imprisoned. In fairness, and for the sake of an honest and complete account, I'll note this. John Bittrolff has consistently maintained his innocence, and, as convicted people are entitled to do, he has pursued appeals and challenges to his conviction. His case has also, at times, been discussed within the wider, still unfolding landscape of Long Island's unsolved killings, a landscape that has produced its own separate, ongoing investigations. But the conviction that stands today, the one a jury returned after 6 weeks of evidence, rests on that central, stubborn fact. John Bittrolff's own DNA was found on both murdered women. On the strength of that, 12 jurors found him guilty, and he is serving 50 years to life. I've called this a landmark case, and I want to explain exactly why, because its place in forensic history is real and specific. The conviction of John Bittrolff is recognized as the first homicide conviction in New York State obtained on the basis of a partial DNA match, a familial DNA hit. That's not a small thing. It was a proof of concept, written in a courtroom, for an entire technique. Think about what it demonstrated. It proved that a murderer could be brought to justice even if his own DNA was nowhere in any database, as long as a close relative's DNA was. It proved that New York's controversial decision to collect DNA from everyone convicted of any crime, however minor, could reach back 2 decades and solve murders that had otherwise hit a total dead end. In fact, the state's criminal justice division noted that this partial match approach, enabled by that 2012 all crimes law, generated well over 1,000 investigative leads. Rita and Colleen's case was the one that showed, definitively, that those leads could end in a homicide conviction. And it sharpens the ethical question we raised earlier, rather than resolving it. Because notice what actually happened. John Bittrolff's genetic privacy was effectively pierced not by anything he did, but by his brother's minor conviction. Timothy Bittrolff, by being convicted of a small offense, involuntarily exposed his brother. And in principle, everyone in that database exposes their parents, their siblings, their children to the same searching. Supporters look at Rita and Colleen and say, that is a price worth paying, because 2 murdered women got justice, and a killer is off the streets. Critics look at the same facts and say, we have built a system where your genetic fate can be decided by a relative's brush with the law, where innocent people are searchable through no act of their own. Both things are true. This case is exactly where the promise and the peril of familial DNA meet. It caught a double murderer, and it did so by turning a family's shared blood into evidence. That is the landmark, and that is the dilemma, in a single case. Let me draw out the 3 things this case leaves us with, because each one matters on its own. The first is the power and the distinctiveness of familial DNA. We spend a lot of time on this channel on genetic genealogy, the distant cousin family tree method. Familial DNA searching is its close but different cousin. It stays inside the criminal database and looks for first-degree relatives, parents, siblings, children, of people already on file. It's a narrower tool, but in the right case, a devastatingly effective one. Here, it meant that a killer's own clean record couldn't save him, because his brother's small mistake put the family in the system. The lesson is stark. If you have committed a violent crime and left your DNA behind, you are no longer safe simply because you personally have stayed out of the database. Your relatives can give you up without ever intending to. The second is the ethical weight, which I've tried to present fairly, and which I'll leave with you rather than resolve for you. Familial DNA saves lives and solves murders, and it does so by making the innocent relatives of offenders permanently searchable. Where the balance between public safety and genetic privacy should sit is a genuine and unsettled question, and this case puts it in the sharpest possible relief. It's worth thinking about honestly, from both sides. And the third, the one I care about most, is the victims. Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee were exactly the kind of victims the world is trained to overlook. Marginalized women, easy to categorize and dismiss, easy to forget. Their killer chose them, in part, because he believed they were forgettable. He was wrong. It took 20 years, and it took a genuinely unlikely chain of events to get there. But the system did, in the end, come back for Rita and Colleen. It said, with a conviction and a 50-year sentence, that their lives had counted, that their deaths demanded an answer, and that no one is disposable. That, more than the forensic milestone, is why this case matters. Let me end with Rita and Colleen, because they are the whole reason this story deserves to be told. Rita Tangredi was 31 years old, and she was somebody's mother. Her son Anthony was 11 when she was taken from him, a little boy who lost his mom and then spent his childhood, his adolescence, and much of his adulthood not knowing who had done it or why. When John Bittrolff was finally convicted, Anthony was a grown man, more than 2 decades removed from the mother he'd lost as a child. That's what 20 years of a cold case costs. Not an abstraction, but a boy's entire growing up, spent under the weight of an unanswered question. Colleen McNamee was 20 years old, a young woman whose life had barely begun, ended in the woods, discarded by a man who assumed no one would ever come looking. For 20 years, it seemed he might be right, but he wasn't. And the way he was proven wrong is, I think, the strange grace note of this whole story. John Bittrolff did everything right, from a killer's cold perspective. He chose victims society undervalued. He kept his own record clean. He stayed out of the database. He blended into an ordinary life. He controlled every variable he could think of. And it didn't matter, because there was one variable no killer can ever control, which is the DNA he shares with the people he's related to. His brother's small brush with the law, and a bold state law, and a preserved sample in a freezer, and 20 years of patience, all converged to say the names the killer had tried to erase. Rita Tangredi, Colleen McNamee. Two women the world was too quick to forget, who were not forgotten after all. Say their names with me, and mean them. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.